Slasher movies dominated the 1980s, and for every major hit like Friday the 13th or A Nightmare on Elm Street, there were dozens of other crazy killers that got lost in the crowd, never getting the recognition they deserve. So we're going back for another helping of 80s deep-cut slashers that you need to know about. Welcome to the Cinema Cult. I'm CT, back with 8 more of my favorite lesser-known slasher movies that the 1980s had to offer. And this time we're getting into some regional slashers that have gone under the radar, along with a few can't-miss cult classics sure to please any horror fan, especially if you love gory practical effects. And speaking of gory practical effects, I gotta get things started with a film that got a few mentions in the comments from my last deep dive slashers list. It's a by-the-book slasher that's elevated with some very gnarly Tom Savini effects, and this one's called The Prowler. The Prowler rolled out regionally in the US in 1981, but it was dead on arrival and made less than $1 million. Meanwhile, Europe and Australia, they got stuck with a version of this film with all the good gory parts cut out and renamed to Rosemary's Killer. But this is still an important film in slasher history, since it marks the first time that director Joseph Zito and effects artist Tom Savini would work together. And they'd reunite in 1984 for one of my favorite Friday the 13th movies, Part 4, The Final Chapter. Now, even without those connections, I think The Prowler was still destined to be a slasher cult classic thanks to the gruesome special effects and this killer's penchant for pitchfork impalements. And this story begins way back in the 1940s when a jilted ex-boyfriend returns from the war looking to kill the girl who dumped him and her new dude. And he stalks them from the shadows as they leave the annual graduation party for some gazebo alone time, and the double pitchfork kill right off the bat, well, that lets you know this movie's not going to be messing around. Skip to 35 years later, and Avalon Bay is bringing the graduation dance back, and apparently someone's not too happy about that. From there, this movie mostly follows Pam and her sheriff's deputy boyfriend Mark trying to identify this killer decked out in full military garb, while he prowls around town, picking off youths and stirring up reminders of those original murders. Now, if there's one scene that shows this Prowler hasn't lost a step over the years, it's Sherry's shower kill scene. The Prowler's already taken out her boyfriend Carl with a bayonet through the top of his skull, and then he follows that up with, I think, the most memorable kill of the movie, impaling Sherry in the shower and leaving her pinned right in the tile. The middle stretch of this movie does drag a bit as Pam and Mark dig into the mystery of the story, but it never lets you get too bored since there's always another body to add to the count and a red herring or two to keep you on your toes. Now, in classic slasher tradition, The Prowler finishes with an epic cat and mouse chase between the Prowler and final girl Pam that includes a slow-mo head explosion that gorehounds will absolutely appreciate. Moving on, I've got a slasher made in North Carolina by an overachieving group of amateurs with kills so controversial it originally received an X rating. It's called The Mutilator. Released in 1984 under its original, much lamer title, Fall Break, The Mutilator is a low-budget regional slasher that's entertaining despite its faults. And just like a lot of 80s slasher villains, this bad guy's motivations for murder are rooted in trauma from the past. The movie opens with a young Ed accidentally firing off one of his father's rifles and killing his mom in the next room. And Big Ed comes home, and upon discovering the scene, he has himself a whiskey and a mental breakdown. And suddenly, the movie jumps ahead to the present. Now we got young Ed in college, hanging with his friends, and Big Ed calls him up and demands that he prepare the family's beach condo for the off-season. Young Ed's not really interested, but his friends convince him because, what the hell, they can make a weekend out of it. It is fall break after all.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Truthfully, the first half hour or so of this movie is more of a bad 80s college comedy than a slasher, but if you can get through the corny jokes and all the exposition about Big Ed's hunting, you'll be rewarded with some truly crazy slasher action in the back half of this film. Because this guy, Big Ed, is so deranged, he's literally been dreaming about killing his son. So now that he's got the chance to rage out for real on young Ed and his friends, he won't be holding back. This movie covers many of the standard slasher tropes you'd expect to see, like the skinny dipper getting pulled underwater and the only police officer for miles around getting decapitated, but the scene most responsible for this movie receiving an X rating, it's gotta be Sue getting a massive fishing gaff driven right through her groin and out her stomach. It's a nasty death that's controversial to this day. But somehow, that's not even the wildest scene of this movie. And the final battle between Big Ed and these U's ends in such a bizarre fashion, I wouldn't want to spoil it for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of checking this one out yet. So if you like grimy regional slashers, The Mutilator is about as good as it gets. And moving on to a new region, we're going to go to the West Coast for this next one with maybe the most beautifully shot movie on this list. It's time to check out The Final Terror. The Final Terror is a gritty, slow burn slasher that almost feels like something out of the 70s rather than the 80s. It's an early film from director Andrew Davis, who later became known for directing action films like Under Siege, The Fugitive, and Collateral Damage. But don't let those action credentials fool you, because this movie is way more interested in cinematic shots of the forest and building tension rather than crazy action sequences. And after sitting on the shelves for 2 years, The Final Terror was finally released in 1983, thanks to the newfound fame of cast members like Daryl Hannah and Rachel Ward, and the addition of a newly shot intro sequence that feels a little disconnected from the rest of the movie, but does up the body count. The main story follows a group of young, would-be forest rangers heading into the wilderness for a working vacation with some young ladies in tow. And I really appreciate how well set up this story is. Everything from the dynamics of the group to the camping location are really important to how this story plays out, and the early scenes are full of hints as to the killer's identity. And I also really love when a slasher movie includes a classic campfire story scene, and this one is a particularly brutal tale about a young woman who ends up in a nearby institution only to be broken out decades later by her estranged son. It's a disturbing bit of backstory that sort of hangs over the rest of this movie as folks start disappearing, and this group finds strange things out in the wilderness that shouldn't be there, like a cabin filled with disturbing and stolen items. And these guys normally know how to handle the woods, but this threat is more than they prepared for, and this killer knows the land far better than they do. The Final Terror is more interested in maintaining a tense atmosphere than piling up a bunch of violent death scenes, but because of that, when the violence does occur, it hits a lot harder. So if you appreciate slow burn slashers in the wilderness where characters make rational choices and still end up bloody, you should make time for The Final Terror. It's a movie that rewards patience and, in my opinion, gets even better on a second viewing. Next up, I'm keeping it regional, but we're getting off the coast and heading to Oklahoma. This one's a lakeside slasher filmed at the Fort Gibson Dam. It's called Terror at Tenkiller. Released in 1986, Terror at Tenkiller is a no-frills, ultra-low-budget slasher that swings for the fences anyway, and well, depending on your taste, you might find that to be really fun or just plain cheap. It was shot on location in Oklahoma with a cast mostly made up of USC students, resulting in a movie that feels almost handcrafted. It's weird, not because it's trying to be, just because it is. But things start off pretty normally for a slasher film. We've got a faceless, knife-wielding killer chasing down and slicing up a terrified victim and then dumping her body in the lake. We also get to meet the two leads, Leslie and Jana, who are going to be spending the summer at this lake to get away from Leslie's jerk of a boyfriend, Josh. And that's when the interesting choices start creeping in. This is not a difficult plot to follow, but for some reason the filmmakers decided a narrative voiceover from Leslie would make a great addition.
Josh always had a problem, but little did I know that it would lead me into the most terrifying summer of my life.
Then, after spending some time establishing that Josh is borderline abusive and could easily be the killer, well, this movie inexplicably gives away who the real killer is, a denim-clad psycho choking out the diner waitress, and this guy's name is Tor. Now, even by regional slasher standards, the kills in this movie are basic and oftentimes bloodless. Things start to ramp up for the girls as more folks start disappearing, and they start receiving threatening phone calls. Terror at Tenkiller isn't going to win any awards for being clever or well written, and the kills in this movie probably wouldn't shock a first grader, but there's an amateurish charm about this movie that's just undeniable. So if you're looking for an easy to follow slasher that's not going to trick you with any red herrings and really mostly subsists on chill vibes, Terror at Tenkiller might be just what you're looking for. And of course, Americans weren't the only ones making these slasher films, and next up I've got what might be my favorite early 80s Canadian slasher, My Bloody Valentine. I've always kind of considered My Bloody Valentine to be like the Canadian counterpart to The Prowler, because these two movies have so much in common. They were both released in 1981 and revolve around a plot involving a canceled dance being reinstated decades later, with a killer who's none too happy about it. Plus, both these movies were absolutely butchered by the censors. Thankfully, nowadays we can enjoy the unrated version of My Bloody Valentine, which has restored most of its gory goodness. Now, I absolutely loved the setting of this movie, though. It was filmed on location in an old coal mining town in Nova Scotia, and it reminds me so much of the old mining town I grew up in Pennsylvania. There's even some classic small town drama when TJ returns, only to find that his old girlfriend Sarah is now dating his fellow coal miner Axel. My Bloody Valentine is of course set around the Valentine's Day holiday, and it leans heavily into those themes. At first, it's not even dead bodies showing up, but heart-shaped candy boxes containing real human hearts. And the authorities try to keep things under wraps and even cancel the Valentine's dance out of an abundance of caution. Meanwhile, the kids are determined to find a place to party, and there's nowhere more private than down in the mines. And there are some pretty memorable kills in this film. My favorite has to be the bartender who's trying to set up a prank, but instead he comes across the real killer and gets a pickaxe straight through his face for his troubles. Now, this movie does get significantly more tense once things move down into the mines. It's an extremely claustrophobic location, and this killer is downright intimidating as he continues to up the body count underground, maintaining anonymity behind his gas mask. Now, shooting these scenes in an actual mine gives this movie an authenticity that really couldn't be replicated on a Hollywood soundstage, and it just makes me appreciate these underground scenes all that much more. So if you're looking for an 80s slasher that can go from atmospheric to downright mean, with a classic whodunit setup that'll keep you guessing, you definitely need to check out My Bloody Valentine. And up next, I've got the first of two movies on this list filmed in Florida. This one's as much a gritty thriller as it is a slasher. It's called Eyes of a Stranger. Right off the bat, I just love the title of this movie. Eyes of a Stranger makes it sound like this could be an American giallo film, but this is no giallo. It's a sleazy, oftentimes disturbing movie that gets more dark and uncomfortable as it unfolds. Now, this one was originally conceived as a straight-up thriller, but with the increasing popularity of slasher films, these filmmakers did the smart thing and brought in Tom Savini to up the gore and make these kills even more brutal. And you could see his influence right from the opening scenes. Because most movies like to start out by introducing the protagonist, but here, we start by watching this killer do his work in a scene that feels downright voyeuristic. After following this woman home from work, he starts making phone calls that get increasingly disturbing. Now, almost on cue, her boyfriend shows up, but that makes no difference, and the killer makes quick work of him before moving on to assault and kill the young woman. It's a scene that can be uncomfortable to watch, but at the same time, I can't help but appreciate that awesome head in an aquarium effect. After showing the audience what this psychopath is capable of, Eyes of a Stranger introduces the main characters. Got Jane, a TV news reporter, and her younger sister Tracy, played by a pre-Fast Times at Ridgemont High Jennifer Jason Leigh in her film debut. Now, Tracy's both blind and deaf as a result of a childhood assault that Jane still blames herself for. In a sick twist, these two live in the same apartment complex as the killer, and as the murders continue, Jane becomes increasingly convinced that her neighbor is the man responsible. Now, the tone of this movie, it can be odd. Sometimes it feels almost like a made-for-TV movie, but then the scenes with the killer get so brutally violent, it can be a real whiplash to watch. This killer is genuinely creepy and seriously enjoys psychologically torturing his victims before he kills them. And the sequences where the killer toys with Jane in the apartment are super tense, and they build up to a final act that goes completely off the rails in a very 1980s way, leaning into some interesting logic that made me think of a very different movie.
Falls in a well, eyes go cross, she gets kicked by a mule, they go back to normal. I don't know.
Yeah, so after Eyes of a Stranger, you might be in the mood for something that takes itself a little less seriously, and I've got just the thing. We're keeping it in Florida for my next selection. It's an Italian-American co-production. It's called Nightmare Beach. By the late 1980s, the slasher craze had pretty much run its course, which made for some very interesting movies as filmmakers started blending slasher themes with other subgenres. Released in 1989, Nightmare Beach is one of those movies. From one scene to the next, it can't decide if it wants to be a biker gang movie, a spring break sex comedy, a police procedural, or a slasher. But somehow, the whole thing works if you just turn your brain off and go along with it. Nightmare Beach also begins with a setup that might remind you of another 1989 slasher film, Wes Craven's Shocker, because this one also opens with a convicted murderer being executed in an electric chair and promising the audience he'll be back for revenge. And not long after, it looks like that may be the case. A mysterious biker picks up a hitchhiker, and what she doesn't know is this hog's back seat is rigged up like an electric chair. Before she realizes it, sparks are flying and she's toast. Literally. From there, this movie heads over to Daytona Beach, overrun with spring breakers looking to get drunk and have a good time. Well, everyone besides ex-star quarterback Skip at least, but when his horn dog buddy disappears, he joins up with local bartender Gail, and they try to find him. Standing in their way though, we got a corrupt police force led by John Saxon as chief striker and the local biker gang named the Demons. This movie also has a whole cast of side characters introduced just to up the body count, but you know what, I enjoy they all get their own little backstories too. We got a drunk Go Gators guy and the neighbor across the hallway who seems to be funding her spring break one John at a time. Yeah, if ADD were a movie, it might be Nightmare Beach. This is the sort of movie I kind of love despite its flaws. We got rough acting, a story that's all over the place, but there's some very inventive kills here, and the final act goes completely off the rails, just like a movie like this should. So if you're looking for a spring break slasher that doesn't take itself too seriously, check out Nightmare Beach. Moving on, for my last selection, I'm going full Italian with a single location slasher considered by many to be a classic. Let's get into StageFright. Released in 1987, this Italian slasher ditches the great outdoors, instead trapping its cast inside a soundstage during an overnight rehearsal for a theater production. Now, I'm a sucker for single location horror, and this movie takes full advantage of that soundstage setting. And StageFright was the first feature directed by Dario Argento protege Michele Soavi, who would go on to direct movies like The Church and Cemetery Man, but this one's always been my favorite film of his. Now, the setup here, it's efficient. You've got a dickish director pushing his cast beyond their limits, and when an actress is taken to the hospital after injuring her ankle, they return with an unseen hitchhiker looking to murder. And in a fun twist, this psycho killer used to be an actor himself, so he feels right at home in this soundstage location, and he quickly disguises himself as the production's villain, donning the iconic owl mask and murdering one of the actresses on stage right in front of everyone. And by the time they realize anything's wrong, not only is this actress dead, the phone lines are cut, the lights are out, and they're totally locked in. From there, this is a flat-out survival movie where this killer moves confidently through his surroundings, picking these thespians off with some extremely gnarly kills. In the maze of catwalks and understage crawl spaces, this dude could be anywhere and no one is safe. And the battle between Final Girl Alicia and the owl-headed madman is absolutely awesome. These two go at it like a couple of prize fighters, and just when you think it must be over, it's time for another round. But StageFright, it's one of those rare slashers that's entertaining from beginning to end. It takes full advantage of its limited location and the relentless villain within. So if you're new to Italian horror, This is a great movie to start out with. It's got enough of that Italian strangeness to stand out from your standard slasher fare without going totally overboard, and it's just fun all the way through. So there you have it, 8 more deep cut slashers from the 1980s that belong on every horror fan's watch list. And the 80s were packed with independent and regional slashers made by people whose ideas and ambitions usually outweighed their budget, but to me, that's just part of the charm. So if I didn't get around to your favorite retro slasher today, make sure you let me know about it in the comments. I want to hear all your recommendations featuring backwoods locations, weird local legends, or bizarre plot lines that don't have to make sense. And if you had a good time revisiting these slashers with me today, make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons to join the cult. And if you're looking for more of my favorite 80s slasher deep cuts, well, you can check out part 1 of this series right here. And that's it for today. I'm CT Reese. Thanks for hanging out with me, and keep watching weird movies. I know I will.